Good evening. You're watching the main news on HKIBC. I'm Raymond Yeung. Here are tonight's top stories. A man who bit off the ear of a district councillor is convicted. The government estimates that 127,000 families are living in poor conditions. And gift baskets for 2 senior immigration officers trigger a controversy. A man who bit off a district councillor's ear during a scuffle 2 years ago has been found guilty of wounding with intent. A jury also convicted Joe Chen of 3 other charges, and he will be sentenced in February.
In one of the bloodiest scenes of the 2019 anti-government protests, Andrew Chew had his left ear bitten off in front of a crowd of journalists and onlookers. Chew, who was then a Democratic Party district councillor, had been trying to mediate a dispute outside City Plaza in Taikoo Shing. He arrived at the scene after the assailant, Joe Chen, had injured 3 other people, 2 with a knife. Chen denied 3 counts of wounding with intent and 1 count of common assault. Now unemployed, the 50-year-old insisted he was intoxicated at the time and had no recollection of the attacks. After deliberating for 3 hours, the 7-member High Court jury found Chen guilty of all 4 counts. Unanimous verdicts were reached on 2 counts of wounding with intent regarding the assaults on Chew and Lewis Wan, who was slashed in the stomach and admitted to hospital in critical condition. The offense is punishable by life in prison. By a majority of 6-1, the jury found Chen guilty of wounding Wan's wife, Leung Pik-kay, who was stabbed several times in the back. The jury then unanimously convicted Chen of common assault for punching Leung Ying, the cousin of Leung Pik-kay. Judge Juliana Barnes adjourned sentencing to February 9th, pending psychiatric assessments on the defendant and the psychological reports of the victims.
At least 127,000 families in the city are estimated to be living in poor conditions, according to the government's latest report. Authorities also announced that its housing supply target for the next decade will stay at 430,000 units. Johanna Chan reports.
Hong Kongers can expect little change in housing in the next 10 years. The government announced today that the housing supply target will remain at 430,000 units. The ratio for public and private housing will stay the same at 70-30. This means around 129,000 units will be set aside for the private sector. Of the other 301,000 units, 210,000 will be public housing and green form subsidized scheme flats, while 91,000 will be home ownership scheme and subsidized housing units. The average waiting time for public rental housing has risen to 5.9 years, the longest in more than 2 decades. Authorities already have around 350 hectares of land, enough for 330,000 public housing units. A third of those units are expected to be completed in the next 5 years as they go through the rezoning process. The rest can be expected in the latter half of the decade. The government also said the number of families estimated to be inadequately housed has risen to 127,000, up 5,000 from the previous estimate, with 92,200 living in subdivided flats. Housing Chief Frank Chan said the government will increase supply by pushing forward development projects and redevelop the housing authority's old estates and factory estates.
Finding land is easier, but forming land and building the infrastructure and associated welfare facilities and common facilities for the community, it will take a little bit of time. By compressing all the work we are doing and in planning, it still takes time, and therefore I would say that the housing supply will be much more and faster in the years to come.
Chan also welcomed New World Development's move to launch subsidized homes, saying discussions are ongoing over land premiums. Johanna Chan, HKIBC.
The British government has rejected a move to expand a scheme to allow Hong Kongers born after 1997 to settle in the United Kingdom. Authorities said the proposal was too broad. Winner Wong reports.
An amendment supported by lawmakers across the British political spectrum sought to allow Hong Kongers under the age of 25 to settle in Britain without having to depend on a parent with British national overseas status. They argued that it's needed because the current BNO visa scheme leaves young people out.
The problem is that many of the dissenters and demonstrators in Hong Kong are under 25 and are therefore too young to have qualified under that route as it currently stands. We all have a duty to the brave people fighting for democratic values, our values, in Hong Kong.
The government, however, said the clause was too broad.
I would say there are issues with the clause as it is drafted, given it doesn't contain an age limit, and its scope could even extend to those who have actually never set foot in Hong Kong. However, we hear the very strong points that are made.
Foster said there are other routes open to young Hong Kongers, including the Youth Mobility Scheme and the Skilled Workers Visa. England-based charity Hong Kong Watch said the government's decision to reject the amendment was deeply disappointing. But it's not over yet. A version of the bill is set to be discussed in the House of Lords. In its daily press briefing yesterday, Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said Beijing opposes British interference in China's internal affairs. Winner Wang, HKIBC.
A former ICAC investigator says anti-corruption laws would be violated if a company which has a work relationship with the government department offers advantages to officers. This comes as two immigration officers defended themselves after receiving gifts from a property developer. Johanna Chan has more.
Online website Stan News reported in an exclusive that Deputy Director of Immigration Benson Kwok and Principal Immigration Officer Jackie Wong had received gift baskets worth $3,388 from property giant Evergrande. The gifts were delivered several days before the Mid-Autumn Festival in September. The pair admitted receiving gifts from Evergrande Executive Director Andrew Huang, but said they were close personal friends. Kwok said the gifts were bought at a 15% discount, which meant they cost under $3,000. The Prevention of Bribery Ordinance does not explicitly list exemptions, but officers need the chief executive's permission to receive gifts. Government rules state that officers may receive gifts under $3,000 from close personal friends and $1,500 from other people on traditional and special occasions, such as a birthday or wedding. The Immigration Department said Kwok and Wong had reported on Sunday they had received gifts from a friend, but the value was below the permitted limit. The department is looking into the issue. Former ICAC Chief Investigator Stephen Char went on radio this morning to air his views. He said if there is any work relationship between the Immigration Department and Evergrande, that could breach Section 8 of the anti-bribery law, which states that anyone who has dealings with the government will be guilty if they offer advantages to officers. Public officials convicted and jailed under the ordinance include former Chief Executive Donald Tsang for not disclosing a property deal while in office, and former Chief Secretary Raphael Hui for bribery and misconduct by concealing financial benefits. Johanna Chan, HKIBC.
Overseas, former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak's hopes of a political comeback have evaporated after losing his appeal on a corruption conviction. Appearing on video, Najib expressed disappointment with the Court of Appeal ruling and again denied any wrongdoing in a scandal which has been described as the worst form of kleptocracy. More than $4.5 billion was stolen from State Fund 1MDB, with Najib accused of pocketing a large chunk. The court called his acts a national embarrassment and upheld his conviction and jail term in the first of his 5 corruption trials. Najib is on bail as he appeals to the highest court, but cannot contest the next elections unless he gets a royal pardon. The head of Britain's diplomatic service has defended his office's response after the Taliban seized Afghanistan. Philip Barton was on holiday until 3 days before a deadline to evacuate Afghans who worked for the British troops during the 20-year Western occupation.
I genuinely don't think it was about lack of urgency or lack of grip. I think it was about the scale and complexity of the circumstances we all face. This wasn't about work-life balance. This is about rostering shifts in a crisis to make sure people don't burn out in a crisis and work too long in one period of time.
Barton regretted his absence at a time when threatened Afghans were trapped behind enemy lines. He said it was not certain that Kabul would fall so soon, adding that 15,000 people were eventually pulled out. Thousands more were left behind. Former Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who was also on holiday during the crisis, was accused of toying with the lives of Afghans who risked theirs for Britain. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, meanwhile, denied prioritizing the evacuation of dogs over humans. And coming up after the break, tensions over Ukraine persist despite video summit between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin.